Sex and death are two impulses directly linked to war. Although they seem like completely separate things, territorial conquests end up being symbolic conquests as well, unfortunately, in many cases involving sexual violence against women. For Nazism, this was a planned state policy carried out throughout Europe, resulting in the violation of more than 34,000 women. Militarized brothels with slaves from numerous countries, spy prostitutes in Berlin, and exclusive brothels for prisoners in concentration camps are just some of the methods employed by the Third Reich to control the sexual lives of its soldiers and prisoners. In this new military history video, we want to tell you in detail how these macabre establishments worked and what was the importance of prostitution in Adolf Hitler's conquest policy. Let's begin. As Nazism advanced across Europe, acquiring new territories almost daily, high-ranking officers understood the need to establish not only military bases, but also brothels managed by the Reich. These were establishments where Sherman soldiers could have forced sexual relations with enslaved women. This morbid state policy had two clear purposes. On the one hand, it promoted the sexuality that Nazism considered normal, preventing soldiers from engaging in excessive masturbation or homosexuality. On the other hand, it aimed to control the women with whom the soldiers fraternized, preventing sexually transmitted diseases that could dangerously reduce the number of men available for combat. Of course, soldiers had no problem obeying orders. Typically, military brothels operated in old mansions, buildings, or even in brothels taken over by SS officers. The structure was used to transport women from the region, or even girls from distant countries who were installed as prisoners in those places. One incredible example occurred in the French city of Brest, where SS officers set up a brothel in a synagogue, a humiliation for both French women and Judaism. Under the Star of David, the schedules when Hitler's soldiers could avail themselves of the services of the place were displayed. It's important to clarify that when we talk about services, we actually mean systematic rapes by Sherman troops. The girls living in these military brothels did not do so voluntarily. The vast majority were victims of mass abductions or kidnappings in small villages. Officers would arrive, choose the most attractive girls, primarily those who met Aryan beauty standards, and take them as prisoners. In the everyday life of a young Nazi, sex with Slavic women was strictly forbidden, as they were considered an inferior caste. However, within the brothels, such relationships were allowed. The only exception for the SS was Jewish and Romani women, who were excluded and taken to concentration camps. Later, we will tell you the horrifying role many played there. These war crimes were not a secret. During the conflict, several invaded European states issued official complaints about the mass abductions of women. The Polish government in exile did the same on May 3, 1941. Stating that the SS conducted raids to take young Polish women to their dark, militarized brothels. The incredible part is that, on paper, Nazism considered prostitution a social disease that degenerated the minds of the youth. But apparently, that moral rule did not apply in times of war. Even the officers of the Third Reich did not abstain from this practice. Life in Nazi brothels was a true hell on earth, with subhuman health conditions. In the old destroyed buildings, several girls lived, sleeping and receiving their velattors in the same bed. There were no changes of clothes or nutritious meals, only the basic conditions to make the slaves attractive enough for Sherman troops. A common problem was sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis and gonorrhea. If a girl was diagnosed with these conditions, she was treated in a very rudimentary and disinterested manner. There would always be a prisoner to replace her. If the young woman did not improve soon, her fate was the firing squad and an unmarked grave. As we mentioned earlier, the military management of brothels also sought to appease the epidemics of these diseases, which could incapacitate a soldier for a long time. It was precisely for this reason that British spy Virginia Hall organized a series of clandestine brothels where women intentionally infected soldiers. But that's a topic for another video. As you can see, sex and prostitution are fundamental aspects of war. For the Sherman soldiers who occupied France, the summer of 1940 felt like a long vacation in which they had the opportunity to occupy the enemy's most prized city, but also to flirt and harass French women, as these amateur Nazi photographers did. France was one of the main epicenters of European prostitution. Many authors ironically describe the period between 1940 and 1945 as a golden age for the profession in the country. Prostitutes expanded their businesses like never before, and more than 10,000 women had to become prostitutes to survive the horrors of war. The vast majority of their clients were the very Nazis who had humiliated their army and people. However, as paid sex increased, so did the hatred and resentment of the rest of the French towards those who offered their services to the enemy. The tragic part is that for many women who were victims of Sherman brothels in Europe, the hell did not end in 1945 with the unconditional defeat of the Third Reich. Once the conflict was over, prostitutes were persecuted as traitors to the homeland and collaborators with the Nazi regime. In France, prostitutes were lynched, publicly stripped, shaved, and had a swastika painted on their faces as seen in this shocking video. Like Cain's mark, they were forced to march with the sign that they had slept with SS officers. Others were shaved, and they went down in history as femmes tendues, or shaved women. In these cases, they were victims of violence during and after World War II. While concentration camps were a world apart from reality, with their own rules and horrors, the fact is that several institutions from the outside world operated within those facilities, and brothels were no exception. You might think that these spaces were reserved only for guards and officers overseeing the camps, but there were also women designated for the most important prisoners, those who collaborated with Nazism or organized the workforce of their fellow inmates. The women who worked in these facilities did not do so voluntarily, but were forced and threatened. One of the first concentration camp brothels, or Lager Bordel, was established in the Mauthausen camp in 1942 to boost prisoners' productivity. In June 1943, One was set up in Auschwitz, and the following month, another in Buchenwald. This policy took inspiration from Soviet gulags, where the amount of work determined Gula prisoners' food ration. Those who worked properly and collaborated with SS officers had permission to visit these places. This service was mainly used by kapos, prisoners of certain status within the camp, with a somewhat less harsh life and more access to resources such as food and hygiene. The rest of the prisoners did not have the necessary energy to attend these establishments. Sexual encounters in these brothels were entirely supervised and planned. According to researchers, only the missionary position was allowed, and the act was limited to a maximum of 15 minutes, not a minute more. The horror generally occurred at night between 8 and 10 p.m., although on Sundays the shift was much longer, making it the most grueling and painful day for the prisoners. They had to endure eternal hours, receiving violator after violator in their quarters. The existence of Lager Bordel gave rise to a new form of trade within concentration camps: the exchange of coupons that could be exchanged for sexual encounters. The business was monopolized by common criminals, those who, before being imprisoned, were already breaking the law. A system of green triangles was used, which could be exchanged for 15 minutes of sex. There is also evidence that, in some cases, imprisoned women had a tattoo on their breasts with the inscription Feldhuer, or camp whore, a humiliating way to identify and separate them from the rest of the prison population. As we already mentioned, women in intracamp brothels were forced to perform this work and came from various concentration camps distributed across Europe. For example, one of the most frequent was the entirely female Ravensbrück camp, where the most attractive young women were selected, preferably without Jewish ancestry. The SS officers devised a perverse method that aligned the prostitutes, providing them with minimal benefits, such as slightly higher rations or the possibility of personal hygiene. This generated envy and resentment among the rest of the female population in the camps, thus breaking any possibility of collaboration between the imprisoned women. Nina Mikhailovna, a concentration camp prisoner, later admitted, "When we found out that one of the girls from our block had been chosen, we captured her, threw a blanket over her and beat her until she couldn't move. We didn't know if she would recover. They just sought better treatment, and we punished them in this way." It is estimated that in total about 200 women worked in these brothels with the promise of being released after 6 months, something that never happened. As if the mass rape of women was not enough crime, the Third Reich also embarked on a morbid campaign of sexual re-education within concentration camps. In addition to using brothels to control inmates, encourage collaboration, and prevent disturbances, Heinrich Himmler also tried to use them as a means to show prisoners of the pink triangle, i.e. homosexuals, the pleasures of the opposite sex. It was a conversion therapy, a kind of cure for homosexuality, something that the Third Reich considered a moral degeneration, typical of modernity. Historians claim that Himmler ordered that all gay prisoners make compulsory visits once a week to the camp brothels as a means to cure them of their same-sex attraction. Once the war ended, the few women who survived that torment had to endure the stigma of being camp prostitutes, despite actually being victims of the violence of the Nazi system. The vast majority of the girls who worked in intracamp brothels were of Sherman origin, but had been categorized by the Nazis as asocial. When the conflict ended, they were never recognized as victims or compensated appropriately. The Nazis defined as asocial people without homes, alcoholics, wandering musicians, prostitutes, or any women who did not fit into the ultra-conservative vision of the Nazis. They were generally people from very poor backgrounds. Prostitution within concentration camps was a dark secret, at least until the early 1970s when several memoirs were published, delving into this aspect with some depth. However, the topic remained taboo in research on Nazism until the mid-1990s, when new publications by female researchers broke the silence. One of the strangest and unique cases of using prostitution as a war policy was Salon Kitty. It was a select Berlin brothel operated by Nazism, where, in addition to offering sex and pleasures, espionage campaigns were conducted against important figures. The place operated at number 11 Giesebrechtstrasse, where a building with commercial premises houses a headphone store and an interior decoration store today. However, between 1930 and 1942, the largest brothel of the Third Reich operated there. The important name in this operation was Katja Emma Sophie Schmidt, alias Kitty Schmidt, a woman who operated as the leader of the 500 square meters on the third floor of the building. Prostitutes from all over Europe, mainly from countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia, worked there. Kitty was a music teacher in her 40s who had lived in various parts of the world and had learned the secrets of the night, finding in brothels a secure and perpetually in-demand business. On paper, the Nazis were against these types of establishments that proliferated throughout Berlin during the 1920s. Keep in mind that, before Nazism, it is estimated that 125,000 women and 35,000 men were engaged in sexual services. The difference is that Salon Kitty was intended to be a meeting place for foreign diplomats settled in Berlin or passing through the capital, although the place was also frequented by military personnel and potential internal enemies of Adolf Hitler's regime. The brothel rooms were the ideal place to learn the secrets of the city's most important men. In the intimate lobby of the salon, where a grand piano rested, crystal chandeliers, and thick carpets, it was expected that confidences would be made that could be used by Nazi leaders to punish dissidents or anticipate decisions of friendly countries. For this, a listening device with microphones was installed. What was said in the rooms on the third floor reached the basement, where a network of cables transported the sound to record it on large discs. The masterminds behind the plan were two high-ranking young men from the Nazi regime. On the one hand, Reinhard Heydrich, the ultimate head of security and later co-architect of the Holocaust, who had the idea. And, on the other hand, one of the main exponents of Sherman espionage, Walter Schellenberg, who put it into practice. Or at least, this was the official version for decades since. Over time, disputes have arisen over how Salon Kitty really worked. The truth is that there are many mysteries behind the operation of this establishment, from the true espionage method to how often important personalities attended. One of the most repeated stories is that of Galeazzo Ciano, son-in-law of Benito Mussolini, who attended a cinema near the brothel. Once the lights went down and the movie began, the Italian secretly left to avail himself of Schmidt's girls' services. Ciano returned minutes before the movie ended, just in time to applaud and praise the performances and plot twists. Historians are also not sure about the role of Madame Miss Kitty. Was she a collaborator sympathizing with Nazism, or was she forced to collaborate from her area of expertise? Much of what is supposedly known tends to be confused with another movie, Salon Kitty, an exploitation film by Italian director Tinto Brass. In that film, the events are exaggerated and have much of perverse fantasy. Such was the impact of Nazi spy prostitutes that during the 1970s, a series of films contextualized in Reich brothels and bordellos were filmed. Of course, like in Tinto Brass's film, the percentage of truth was widely diluted in exaggerated and morbid fictions. The paradox is that the stories told by real survivors of prostitution during this time recount much more gruesome and savage events than those in any horror movie.
La prostitución, tanto forzada como voluntaria, fue uno de los fenómenos más importantes durante la Segunda Guerra Mundial. En el caso del Tercer Reich, esta práctica fue militarizada y empleada como arma de combate, tanto para control interno como para llevar a cabo ambiciosas operaciones de espionaje. El uso como herramienta de algo que la ideología nazi consideraba como amoral y degenerado es solo una muestra más de la inconsistencia narrativa dentro de las creencias del nacionalsocialismo. De esta manera llegamos al final de este video. Recuerda que estas son solo algunas de las miles de historias que nos dejó la contienda más violenta del siglo XX. Si quieres seguir conociéndolas, te invitamos a seguirnos y activar las notificaciones. Por el momento nos despedimos hasta la próxima entrega de Historia Militar.